You want to talk about your movie, The Ladybug? Just open?
Not yet.
You don't want to, not yet, huh? I don't want to. Hey. You just let me know when you want me to jump in. Hey, you're the guest here.
Oh, boy, oh, boy.
But life is tough, huh?
Now you got to have the right attitude. Attitude is the whole
of course.
thing. That's the whole thing. Like a friend of mine just got out of prison, Johnny. Did 10 years in prison. Came out, he has the right attitude. In fact, he told me he feels like a new woman, you know?
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, October the 21st, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the bullfighters song, we will have respect, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, no free lunch, the Rodney Dangerfield, the bullfighters song, bishop-barron, Ayn Rand quote, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Alan Dershowitz, and then the enemies of my country. All that and more when I come back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Does a merchant increase his sales by raising prices? Does higher pay of domestic servants induce more housewives to hire help? The situation is no different for other employers. The higher wage rate decreed by Congress for low-paid workers will raise the cost of the goods that these workers produce and must discourage sales. It will also induce employers to replace such workers with other workers, either to do the same work or to produce machinery to do the same work, or to produce machinery to do the work. Milton Friedman. Leave it to the master to point out the unintended consequence of coerced increase in the cost of labor, a pass-through of that expense to the consumer of what the business provides. To deny this is to deny one of the most basic laws of economics, that the cost of goods is embedded in its price, and that labor is itself a contributor to the cost of goods.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
Rules for radical conservatives. A Tale of Two Citizens. As you probably know, out here in Hollywood, we often work with partners when we're writing scripts or developing TV pilots. It's a lonely, cold, and cruel life we liberals lead in sunny SoCal. And like everybody else's wealth but our own, we like to spread the misery around. Which is why most scribes have a writing partner who more or less complements them in just about every aspect of screenwriting. One guy's good at dialogue, while the other handles story structure. One gal writes terrific action sequences, while the other fella handles the mushy stuff. We are absolutely diverse in every possible way. If you don't count race, creed, color, or national origin, or, naturally, political affiliation. A glorious mosaic of monochrome. That's us. Being my own man, I have ventured to break from the prevailing orthodoxy of independent sameness and have decided to write a miniseries with an old friend, whom I'll call Max Jeffries, on account of everybody out here is named either Max or Jeff. Our working title is A Tale of Two Citizens. This time, it's personal. And if you think of it as a cross between that Dickens novel and The Odd Couple, with lots of babes and cool weapons, you'll not be far off. Well, here's the funny thing. As we're writing, we're realizing that the two of us, Max and Dave, are sort of like Charles Darnay and Sidney Carlton, or Felix Unger and Oscar Madison ourselves. I mean, it's amazing. We're polar opposites, even though we both grew up in the same neighborhood in New York, both live out here near each other, even date some of the same chicks. Except for one thing, which is something I promised Max I'd never tell anybody in a million years, especially not out here, on account of it would end his career immediately if anybody ever found out. But I know I can trust you. Max is a closet conservative, which is why I write with him. There, I said it. Now you can finish both our careers, so please use your power wisely. I like the intellectual give and take of an alternative viewpoint, and while I don't subscribe to a single thing he says, retrograde, revanchist opinions like his are best kept to oneself. They do come in handy when we're fleshing out our villains. In fact, people often come up to me on Hollywood Boulevard near Highland while I'm scouting a suitable bit of sidewalk for my inevitable star on the Walk of Fame, and ask me just how I get those slobbering, rapacious capitalist creeps from Halliburton and Bechtel so right. But I just smile my Mona Lisa smile and walk away. Anyway, to give you a flavor of the life I lead out here, and to help you make sense of all that follows, I'm going to give you a sampling of our thought processes and working habits, so that you can see how the sausage that lights up your jumbo plasma TVs is made. Max. So, who's the hero here? Dave. It's obvious, isn't it? Max. To me, yes. The Darnay Felix Unger character. Or as we like to call him, the good guy. Honest, upright, neat, clean. A little fussy and lovable, maybe, but the real spine of our story. Dave. Are you kidding? Everybody hates those guys. Darnay's a hard-luck sap. Felix is a prig. Nothing lovable about either of them. Whereas old Sid is a dissolute opportunist with a yen for Chuck's hot girlfriend, Marie. while Oscar is a world-class slob. Everyman. Max, that is so typical of you lefties, always rooting for the bad guy, the rogue, the outlaw biker type. You're like the Catholic schoolgirl who runs off with the first Hell's Angel she meets. You think everybody in the country shares your taste for your dark, bizarro world, your fantasy of heaven if heaven were hell. Dave, this is why your movies stink. Colorless stories about colorless people. In the bedroom without the bedroom scenes. Max, we prefer the phrase uplifting stories about role models. Dave, Earth to Max, role models died out with the pride of the Yankees, and I always root for Babe Ruth in that picture. Where have you been since Bonnie and Clyde? Max, let's get to work, shall we? So we went to work and came up with the premise for the show. Each week from their home base, that's TV speak for the main set of the show, the place where nearly every episode begins and ends, our two main characters get an impossible save-the-world assignment, like rescuing Osama bin Laden from a secure holding facility in Afghanistan, or else capturing him and sneaking him in there, depending on which way the political winds are blowing when we finally go over to HBO to pitch. In the grand tradition of I Spy, we combine quips and one-liners with exciting action sequences, then wind up back where we started, a nondescript brownstone in Greenwich Village, which the two bachelors share. Here's the hook. The two guys look exactly alike. That's the part we stole from Dickens, who's dead, so no harm, no foul. Their own mothers couldn't tell them apart, which means we can have great fun with identity switching, making love to the same girl, even a little Superman Clark Kent dichotomy type of thing, whenever we want to go full Freudian. The possibilities are endless. Plus, there's this. They hate each other's guts. Dave, we need some backstory. Max, let's keep them mysterious. Dave, viewers are too impatient for mystery. How's this? They were both born at the same hospital at the same time and possibly switched at birth. Brothers from another mother. I tell you, the possibilities are endless. So before you say it's... Max, the stupidest thing I ever heard? Dave, think of the mistaken identity fun we can have. The bed hopping. Max, but the show's not about bed hopping. It's about saving the world. Doing the right thing. Besides, the switched at birth thing went out with Il Trovatore, or maybe big business. Dave, who cares? We've got to give the audience a few yucks along the way. Since this is HBO, a little skin, too. Come on, Max. This is America in the 21st century we're talking about here. Anything goes. Max, well, that's just our problem, isn't it? Dave, now don't go getting all weepy on me. Just because I used to trip you when we played fantasy dodgeball over on the St. Luke's playground. You remember, without the ball so no one would get hurt. You don't have to get sore. Max, sore? You were always jealous because I was an athlete and you were, well, a little runt. You were always afraid I was going to kick your ass. Maybe I should have. Taught you some sense. Dave, so that's why you write all those macho hero parts? Revenge fantasy for your boring childhood? Max, okay, so they're in the brownstone. Chuck's basement apartment is neat as a pin, while Sid's penthouse is a mess. Dave, and then the secure PDA designed to look like a Cuisinart rings, and it's the President of the United States. Max, why does it always have to be the President of the United States? Dave, because he's the only federal official people know anymore. Who would you call? The Secretary of Health and Human Services? Anyway, the Prez calls, and it seems that... Max, the country's in a pickle. Half the people are practically in open revolt, while the other half are mind-numbed robots who answer to the man they call the Dear Leader. Dave, getting excited now. Right, Rush Limbaugh, who's ordered his ditto heads into action against... Max, ditto. The President of the United States. I can see it now. It's a remake of 7 Days in May, but this time with a happy ending. Dave, the last one had a happy ending. Besides, remember our subtitle. This time, it's personal. Max, that's always your subtitle. It's become a cliché. Dave, I prefer to think of it as a trademark. Anyway, spitballing now. What if subtextually, our show's really about a country that appears to be one unified place, but Like our main characters, it's actually a hotbed of resentment and barely disguised hostility. Max, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, eh? Dave, huh? Max, didn't you learn anything at Columbia? Dave, no. Did you? Silence for a moment. Then, Max, what did you mean, switched at birth? To be continued.
And that was Chapter 3 of Rules for Radical Conservatives, and to be absolutely honest, I'm not sure what he's on about there, but maybe in the next chapter we're going to get some more development, and we'll find out. So, back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Introduction. Let priests take care not to accept from the liberal any ideas which, under the mask of good, pretend to reconcile justice with iniquity. Liberal Catholics are wolves in sheep's clothing. The priest must unveil to the people their perfidious plot, their iniquitous design. You will be called papist, clerical, retrograde, intolerant, but pay no heed to the derision and mockery of the wicked. Have courage. You must never yield, nor is there any need to yield. You must go into the attack wholeheartedly, not in secret but in public, not behind barred doors but in the open, in view of all. Bishop Sarto, later Pope Pius X. What exactly is retrograde? A retrograde is one of God's spies, to borrow Shakespeare's term. A retrograde is a deplorable 2.0, the thinking man's version. A retrograde calculates night and day how to return to the old world order of moral and sexual decency, familial patriarchy, local rule and subsidiarity, classical masculinity and femininity, Christian liberty, republican sovereignty, national borders, faith and hope and charity, goodness and beauty and truth, and most subtly and most importantly, the social kingship of Christ. Recall Boromir of Gondor's words about reclaiming Osgiliath. This city was once a jewel of our kingdom, a place of light and beauty and music, and so it shall be once more. Let the armies of Mordor know this: never again will the land of my people fall into enemy hands. The city of Osgiliath has been reclaimed for Gondor. Notwithstanding his eloquence, the retrograde is a devastatingly effective counterpuncher, with good reason. In reference to the planned 2016 infiltration of the American Catholic Church by operatives connected to the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign, Republican Representative Paul Ryan reacted thus: to despise the Catholic Church, accusing her of being seriously retrograde, as Clinton's campaign did, is an insult to millions of people in this entire country. Representative Ryan was wrong. To be counted a retrograde by the radicals, should be an honor worn on the lapels like a badge. In an era of profound spiritual and moral crisis like ours, the retrograde must joyfully cultivate the virtue of righteous fustiness. He must understand that in the trenches, laughter is war. The retrograde has the unique capacity for understanding the discomfiture between the degenerate, radical, infiltrated world of decay on one side and the well-meaning but clueless Christian world on the other. The retrograde recognizes that the overwhelming majority of Christians today clearly have no interest in evangelizing the undecided world, which lies somewhere between Christianity and radicalism, usually naively favoring radicalism. Under a shadow of such desolate and universal reach, becoming one of God's spies amounts to a last resort and a pure necessity. It involves not deep cover, acting like the enemy, but rather half cover, acting as a conservative contra in the secular arena. The retrograde is a crypto-Christian counterinsurgent willing to fight like a Navy SEAL and to think like a counterintelligence officer. Although these rules for retrogrades will never involve the commission of any intrinsic evil, violating any one of the 10 Commandments, the task is grim and gritty, and not for the faint of heart. In fact, this brief introduction will be one of the least subtle references to the book's religious reason for being. God's spies should adopt the mien of mixed martial arts Hall of Famer Bas Rutten and the mission of Father Gabriel Amorth. The following 40 rules govern the retrograde program of attack, recovering, then resuscitating the Christian West. Scattershot at first, the retrograde tends to a rescue mission, since, over the course of the last century, the West's so-called conservatives were so entirely asleep at the wheel. Such conservatives, over the last 3 generations, have forfeited to radicals almost every inch of the landscape without a fight. It is nothing more than feckless cowardice masquerading as Christian charity. Initially, we must recover whatever ground we can. These 40 rules should provide a brusque and at times abrupt start. As our momentum in reclaiming the West grows, so too will our organizational principles sharpen. But for starters, the rules for retrogrades will deliberately involve action which, although calculated, will be blunt, non-surgical, and even artless in some places. The hour is late, and the road before us is both winding and long. The fight ahead, that of re-Christianizing the neo-pagan West, will be ugly. It will be a war of attrition. We will fight with everything we have, our intellects, our hearts, and if necessary, our bodies. Retrogrades, to the streets. Our aim is to reverse the deuced machinations of radicals like Saul Alinsky, who provided the inspiration for these rules by dedicating to Lucifer his rules for radicals. Acknowledgement. Lest we forget to give a reverent acknowledgement to the very first retrograde, from sacred scripture and tradition, the prince of the heavenly host, who fought valiantly to preserve the holy name of God in the face of diabolical sacrilege, and who did it so effectively that he cast like lightning the deceiver of the whole world, Lucifer, and his cabal of demons from the heights of heaven into the pits of hell. Saint Michael, the Archangel.
And that was the introduction to Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left, from Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
Note when their attempts to discredit Jesus failed, the sellout leaders now turn to the literal kill shot. Better for Christ to die than for all of us to perish, a compromised religious leader named Caiaphas says, foreshadowing the sort of sinister pragmatism we see from all too many contemporary Republicrats, who would rather lose to Democrats than lose control of the GOP to conservatives. Caiaphas is concerned that by Christ challenging the status quo, Christ will expose both he and his peers' hypocrisy, while at the same time upsetting the Roman authorities, prompting a violent backlash. In other words, Caiaphas fears man and not God. Just like the Republicrats of today, who fear the backlash of the liberal media lynch mob more than they fear the God they swore their oaths of office to. If you're a Christian, you know that Christ died for the sins of all humankind, so that through his sacrifice and resurrection, we can be reconciled by grace through faith with our Creator. Therefore, Caiaphas didn't kill Christ any more than the Romans did. We killed Christ every time we disobeyed God. But Caiaphas and the Romans didn't understand that, and didn't see the bigger picture. They were operating under the very same myopic and amoral modus operandi the ruling class in our country utilizes today. It's about protecting one's turf, not about doing what's right. Contrast that with Utah Senator Mike Lee responding to snarky political commentators who asked him if the 2013 government shutdown was worth it. He said, quote, "It's always worth it to do the right thing." Many of you listening to this already know this, which is why you're reading this book. That's why I didn't write this book to persuade you to follow the vision of our founding fathers. I wrote this book to help those of you who already are reach those among us who are not. Very few Americans are fully invested in a leftist, secular, progressive worldview. In fact, most Americans aren't fully vested in anything. And the left takes advantage of that. With its shallow talking points meant to tickle the ears of the masses, they dumb down in the government schools they control. Therefore, if we're going to swell our ranks with the patriots it will take to restore our republic, we have to reach the uninitiated. Most of those people won't want to believe the bureaucrats and institutions they put their trust in all these years have sold out the country. Yes, they are informed enough to instinctively know something is wrong, and they don't like where the country is headed. But it's tough to go from complacency to conviction in one step. This is why you hear people say stuff like, "I know Congress is corrupt, but my congressman is a good guy," or "I can't believe some of the stuff they're teaching in public schools nowadays. I sure am glad that doesn't happen at my kid's school." Congress might be less popular than cockroaches and root canals, but 90% of congressional incumbents were reelected in 2012. Becoming a parent has taught me a lot about discipleship. At first I thought I was discipling my kids, but now I know that God has always been using them to disciple me. One of the things you learn with kids is patience and how to reward baby steps. Your kids don't just automatically get it. They are, as Rush Limbaugh would say, young skulls full of mush. It is a step-by-step, never-ending process. As a parent, I have had to learn to consistently reward good behavior and consistently punish bad behavior. Too often, parents become Walmart mom. This is the mom at Walmart whose kids are acting up. So rather than doing the inconvenient thing by disciplining them in public, mom just buys them a treat or a trinket to shut them up. What Walmart mom has now taught her children is that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, when she should have taught them patience is a virtue instead. She is now rewarding bad behavior. Likewise, we reward way too much bad behavior from our politicians. I can't tell you how many times I heard during the 2012 Republican presidential primary, "Anybody but Obama," as if all the candidates were basically the same, when nothing could be further from the truth. Had we learned nothing from the Bush years? Not to mention, could we possibly raise our standard a little higher than anybody better than arguably the most anti-constitutional and anti-Christian president we've ever had? That's like saying anything but a disembowelment and settling for having your throat slit. Now, I don't know about you, but instead of debating the least gruesome ways to die, I'd rather fight for my life. On the other hand, as we disciple our friends and neighbors back towards the traditional American view of law and government, i.e. there is a God, our rights come from him, and government's only purpose or obligation is to defend and secure those God-given rights, we're going to have to learn to reward good behavior, which will often come in the form of baby steps. The ruling class and the media and institutions that enable them have institutionalized many of our fellow Americans into a cynical or nihilistic perspective that things can't get any better. Thus, the best we can hope for is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic so we hit the iceberg last. That's exactly what they want you to believe, so that you no longer hold the system to a real standard or demand your elected officials obey their sworn oaths of office. The idea of real hope and change, not the counterfeit version peddled by Barack Obama, but the kind of real hope and change prevalent at the dawn of American liberty, is unrealistic and unattainable to many Americans today. Sadly, that's even true among many conservatives, libertarians, and Christians. If we want to spur our neighbors from complacency to conviction and inspire our fellow patriots to aim higher with their principles, the art of asking questions to spark critical thinking and deconstruct lies and flawed premises is necessary. Most of us are too prideful to be taught by somebody else. Humility is in short supply these days, and I admit I struggle with that too. However, if you can rhetorically frame the argument with the right questions so that people come to the right conclusion themselves, then they take ownership of that and internalize it. It becomes their belief, not yours. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't always make him drink. Besides, you're not going to be there all the time holding their hand, just like we can't always be there for our kids. If our kids internalize what we've taught them so they take ownership of it, they will act on that even when we're not around. It is the same with our fellow Americans, and especially for our politicians. Conservatives have other priorities higher than government, so we're just never going to be consistently engaged in the process as the statists are. Therefore, it is imperative that we support candidates that don't require a lot of babysitting. Let's use the hot-button issue of marriage as an example. In a culture as divided as ours, it is rare to have a majority on both sides of a debate see something the same way. But it appears as if both a majority of traditionalist conservatives and progressive liberals have made the same mistake. As popular culture becomes increasingly aggressive in its promotion of homosexuality, and Americans appear to be more desensitized to it, both sides of the morality debate have taken that as a sign to mean the American people are poised to affirm it. The left, as well as the increasingly pro-homosexual leadership of the Republican Party, confidently believes the future is on their side. Those of us who believe neither the Bible nor the Constitution are living, breathing documents believe that history is on our side. Poll after poll shows the American people are clearly more willing to put up with homosexual relationships than they were a few years ago. So how do you explain that? At the time this book was being written, the pro-marriage forces had won 89% of the elections in which the issue was contested. In fact, marriage has even won the day in deep blue states like Oregon. Exit polling found 40% of Democrats voted for marriage in the swing state of North Carolina in 2012. On the same day in 2008, when Obama was getting 60% of the popular vote in California and winning Florida, marriage was affirmed by a majority of the very same voters in both states. In the 2012 presidential election, marriage shared the ballot with Mitt Romney in 4 states and did better than Romney in all of those states, including a 24-point swing in Maryland. So how do we reconcile all of this seemingly contradictory data? We do so by recognizing that what we're seeing from the American people isn't a contradiction, but a distinction. The homosexual movement has done a masterful job of destigmatizing those who practice homosexuality as victims of urges they cannot control, but they clearly haven't been as successful at getting the majority of the American people to affirm those same urges as normal or preferable for society. The American people have, on one hand, determined they should not stigmatize those practicing homosexuality more or different than they would those immersed in adultery or pornography. Thanks mainly to the case the homosexual movement has made that this is hypocrisy, and I agree with them that it is, and about the worst thing to be in today's tolerant culture is a hypocrite. On the other hand, the American people clearly are not ready to normalize homosexual relationships to the point of affirmation or on an equal footing with marriage itself, which explains the 31 consecutive election results on the record we have on the issue. I may not be a wannabe political genius like Karl Rove, but even I'm smart enough to recognize a trend after 31 consecutive elections when I see one, especially when that trend crosses geographical and party lines. A majority of the American people seem to be drawing the same distinction with homosexuality they have drawn with drugs. They're fine with decriminalizing or destigmatizing marijuana, but they're also not in favor of outright legalization or the affirmation of narcotics. Many of the Americans who have voted to affirm marriage and not homosexuality still think Ellen and Modern Family are funny, but they're also not ready to affirm that behavior as normal or preferable. The same can be said of adultery and premarital sex. Lots of moral traditionalists have for years watched television shows that include characters, even the good guys, engaging in premarital sex or adultery. This may desensitize them on an individual level. But after the show is over, they don't tell their children to model that behavior or want the government schools teaching their kids how to become better adulterers or fornicators. Furthermore, have you ever noticed that homosexual behavior itself is still not widely portrayed in mainstream pop culture? For example, how often do you see two dudes making out on network television, or two guys waking up next to each other the next morning naked under the sheets, implying they just spent a lust-filled night together, like you do, say, heterosexual couples? Now, why is that? The answer is simple. While the American people have destigmatized those practicing homosexual behavior, they have not destigmatized or affirmed the behavior itself. This explains why pop culture propagandists always make sure the most well-adjusted, wise, and well-liked characters in movies and television are homosexuals. They know on a base level most Americans still view the behavior itself on a spectrum ranging from bizarre to repulsive, so homosexuals are depicted much more than homosexuality is. But what about those polls that show young people will just affirm homosexual relationships as normal when it's their turn to run the culture? Granted, thanks to Christians allowing the left unfettered access to indoctrinating the next generation in government schools, the younger generation of Americans is much more affirming of homosexual behavior than perhaps any generation of human beings in human history. However, since at least the 1960s, the younger generation's been in favor of legalized drugs and prostitution, and soccer's been the fastest growing sport among them as well. But there's little evidence that any of those things are taking over the mainstream of America anytime soon. Once folks grow up and have families of their own, the natural tendency throughout human nature is they become more conservative or traditional. However, we would be wise to not completely count on that with this younger generation and instead realize right now we have a window to undo the damage done by unchallenged indoctrination and propaganda before it's too late.
And that's Chapter 11 of Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again. The thing with Steve Deese that he's missing that are all conservatives, ersatz conservatives miss, is that you need to go after the organizers and not the organized. So if you're going to go after, women want this, they want that, they blah, 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 and you say, well, then it puts you in a position of being anti-woman. Of making statements that are anti-woman instead of asking yourself, well, who's organizing these women? Oh, the National Organization of Women. And there may be some other feminist organizations, but feminist organizations are organizing women to do certain things. You go after now. You go after, in the case of what Steve was talking about with gays, you go after this an organization called GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, Gay and Lesbian, whatever, an Alliance Against Defamation or whatever it's called. So, for instance, let's give you an example. You have what's going on in Florida, for example, where you have strippers that are showing how to be a stripper, a male prostitute stripper type, to kids, to children. Now, you can go after the strippers and say, well, that's immoral and awful and horrible. But again, then you're going to end up getting hit with an ugly stick, right? That you're homophobic and blah, 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 blah. Don't do that. Don't be stupid. What you do instead is you go after the organization that supports it. GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D. Now, the other thing that you want to do is find out, number one, who donates to GLAAD and what else does GLAAD support? Does GLAAD maybe support Hamas? Does GLAAD support some other type of ugly and controversial activities? Maybe GLAAD is anti-American. Maybe they're in support of Iran instead of the United States. And then you can use that as a lever, so to speak. You can say this activity over here is no good because it's supported by an organization that is un-American, anti-American, and political organizations are fair game every day of the week and twice on Sunday. If you go after the people that are organized, the individuals that are taking their clothes off, then you look like a bully. Okay? Don't do that. Don't be stupid. You can be more effective by going after the organization than going after the organized. And so, again, that was Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
I know a lot of people are really bothered by the financial crisis, and not just for practical reasons, but it kind of shakes them spiritually a bit. They're looking for some direction. And I would say this, that it's really important to know that our ultimate goal is God. It's only in God that our souls are at rest, as Augustine said. And the great temptation is always to say, I'll find a substitute. I'll say I'll find my ultimate happiness in pleasure or power or honor or wealth. Now, for Catholics, there's nothing in the world wrong with those things in themselves. We're not Puritans. Nothing wrong with being rich in itself. The trouble is when we substitute those things for God, then our spiritual equilibrium is thrown off. So I think one perspective on this might be, occasionally it's really good when our confidence in wealth or pleasure or power or honor is shaken. My finances are really shaky at the moment. I'm worried about my finances. Okay, that could be a good shaking of the foundations to make you realize there's a transcendent good beyond all those things.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand quote of the day. Quote, "The precondition of a civilized society is the barring of physical force from social relationships, thus establishing the principle that if men wish to deal with one another, they may do so only by means of reason, by discussion, persuasion, and voluntary, uncoerced agreement." Unquote. Back in a minute. Thank you. So I'm looking at social media, and it's a great place to go to practice, to read things and check your conscience and see if anything, if the bells are ringing or the alarms are going off, etc. So I came across a particular post in which the author said, when we have respect for everybody and everything, then we will have world peace. And so at first I thought it's one of these, it's a fallacy. It's basically something, at first blush, it sounds great. Wow, respect, world peace. Because those are the trigger words, basically, the positive trigger words. But there was an alarm going off in my head. My conscience was telling me that something was wrong. So I went ahead and went back and read it again. And that's when I noticed what this author was doing. They were contradicting themselves. Because, you see, if everybody is equal, then nobody is entitled to respect. Think about it. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Marjorie Taylor Greene.
We bring in Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, my pal. Marjorie, thank you for doing this, by the way. Very kind on a Friday. Were you surprised that half or more of the speech was about Ukraine and that 60% or more of the money is about Ukraine? I mean, I thought coming back from Israel, that's where Biden was going to take us, but he didn't.
No, I'm not surprised at all, Larry, because we all know exactly why Joe Biden is so obsessed with Ukraine. He and his family made a lot of money on their corrupt business deals from countries like Ukraine, the Middle East, and China, and many more. And we just got evidence of that today that we put out.
I heard there's something about a couple $100,000 loan that was washed through something that Jim Biden was doing and wound up with Papa Biden. What's that all about, Marjorie?
That's about this check right here, Larry.
Whoa.
This is a copy of the check that Joe Biden's brother, James Biden, wrote to him. And this is a classic example of money laundering. Here's what happened. James Biden wrote this personal check from his personal bank account to his brother, Joe Biden, on the same day that $200,000, which, by the way, is the same amount that this check is for, $200,000 went into AmeriCorps, a failing company that managed rural hospitals, and it was on the verge of bankruptcy. $200,000 went into that company, and then AmeriCorps wrote that $200,000 directly into James Biden's personal bank account. And on the same day, he wrote a check to his brother, Joe Biden. And do you want to know why a failing company was doing loan repayments with James Biden? Well, the bankruptcy court documents reveal that James Biden himself said that because of his last name, it brought very strong political connections that could bring money in from the Middle East.
No. We bring in Georgia.
Thank you. And now, Alan Dershowitz.
I have now decided, and I just wrote an op-ed piece on it, and I'm going to use this podcast. I have now decided to make sure that the names of every student who supports these rapists, murderers, and kidnappers is made public so that we can judge them. Reading a statement made by the NYU, New York University Student Bar Association, which essentially praises Hamas for murdering and raping Jewish women and children. The letter is just signed Rina. I have a First Amendment right to expose her. The same rules should apply to the Ku Klux Klan as should apply to organizations that support these rapists and murderers and beheaders. If you support Hamas's murderous activities in the Gaza and in Israel, you are beneath contempt. And therefore the name of everybody should be publicized. I have now
And that was Alan Dershowitz. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the enemies of my country.
8. Angling his rifle upward, Worthy took his final measured steps to the rocky crest above him. Through his night vision, the sky was a dazzling green starscape flecked with innumerable points of light. But his attention was focused on the ridge he approached at a crouch, and once he reached the top, Worthy took a knee to scan the landscape beyond. The ground to his front fell away in a gentle slope. The buildings of the small village pooled among the landscape's curves and sliced by a single dirt road. He recognized the scene at once, and not just from his review of satellite imagery. This was the same village they'd fought in to kill Bari Khan, and the last time he'd seen that road, his team was speeding west to their exfiltration point. Worthy scanned for immediate threats, observation posts, stray vehicles, figures strolling the periphery of the village. But he saw no movement as a gentle, dusty breeze crossed his sweaty face. He could hear a dog barking somewhere in the village, see a few exterior lights and illuminated windows among the buildings below him. Slipping the shoulder strap of his ruck off one arm, Worthy rolled sideways to remove it and then assumed a prone position to continue watching for anything out of the ordinary. As point man, that was his responsibility as much as leading his team to their objective, and Worthy knew that the other 4 men would remain stationary behind him until he was satisfied. After caching their parachute equipment near the landing zone, they'd made a swift 4-kilometer foot movement across largely flat ground. It had been an easy hike. With the adrenaline from the jump, They probably could have covered twice that distance without breaking stride. Scanning the outskirts of the village, Worthy located their target building, a squat one-story warehouse, the rear door closed and unlit. He knew from their mission planning that the opposite side held 2 rolling doors and a second pedestrian entrance. Duchess's sole intelligence asset in the area had done some daylight drives past the building, texting blurry cell phone snapshots of the building exterior to his agency handler. Satellite imagery and high-altitude drone passes had likewise revealed no notable enemy presence or fortifications outside the building. Bari Khan was lying low, having successfully evaded detection until an NSA algorithm had picked up his voice on intercepted cell communications from a new phone. Duchess had pinpointed his location using a range of intelligence assets at her disposal, placing him at this building beyond any reasonable doubt. At least, they hoped. Speaking quietly, Worthy transmitted, "I've got eyes on the target building. No movement in the village." David replied, "Stand by. I'm coming up to take a look." Worthy keyed his radio twice, indicating that he'd received the transmission, and continued watching the village. Now that he'd established visual of the target area, he had to maintain it. The slightest distraction could cause him to miss some critical change in the situation, and that wasn't going to happen on his watch. The rifle in his grasp was an HK-416, the smaller 5.56mm version of the weapon his team had carried on their previous incursion into Syria. The lighter bullets were a trade-off in range and velocity, but the 416s fired much more quietly with a suppressor, allowed the team to carry more ammo, a key consideration given they'd had to jump in all their equipment, and allowed for faster shooting in the tight confines the team was about to enter in their hunt for Bari Khan. He heard footfalls whispering up the rocky slope behind him, and then David crouched beside him, setting down his rucksack and slipping into the prone at whispering distance. Worthy said nothing, allowing David a chance to take in the scene while the remaining 3 men maintained rear and flank security. After 30 seconds of silence, David whispered, "Looks good." "Yeah," Worthy agreed, trying to sound assured. But David picked up on something in his tone. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he replied. And while that was true, at least in the tactical sense, Worthy had his own reservations about this mission. Namely, what was Bari Khan still doing here? It didn't make any sense. After nearly being killed in the canyon, then being recovered from the village, returning to the area should have been the last thing he'd ever do. The fact that BK had done exactly that was deeply troubling to Worthy, who in his previous career had been privy to more mercenary assassinations than he cared to admit. When an attempt on someone's life failed and they fled the area, they stayed gone. But Bari Khan had done the opposite, and the fact that he wasn't an Arab at all, but a Chinese dissident who'd mysteriously appeared in Syria only for ISIS to roll out the red carpet, made this discrepancy all the more unsettling. But no one on his team seemed terribly concerned about it, besides, perhaps, Ian. The others were simply happy that their target had surfaced again, glad they'd have a chance to finish the job before Bari Khan achieved sufficient notoriety via a body count of innocent civilians. Which, Worthy supposed, was noble enough. He just hoped his nagging gut suspicion was wrong. David said, "Worthy, this isn't the time to hold back. Tell me what's on your mind." "It's nothing," Worthy responded. "Just the fact that BK came back here after what happened is all. It's weird, I agree. But keep in mind that by definition, terrorists aren't always rational actors." Worthy considered a response, but before he could reply, David keyed his radio and transmitted to the team. "Cancer, bring everyone up to my location. We're proceeding to our objective rally point."
And that was The Enemies of My Country, Chapter 8 by Jason Casper. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.